Good afternoon. I am Bill Eileen. I am the director of the Georgia Museum of Art, and I want to welcome you all to our annual Aralee Strange Lecture, one to which we look forward each year since it commemorates the life and work of a philanthropist, a progressive, an activist, and a proponent of fine arts education. In short, someone who through the prose of screenwriting and the dialogue of film made poetry of both the spoken and the written word. Aralee Strange wore a tattooed lightning bolt on her cheek, an apt symbol for inspiration, for the serendipitous moment when an idea occurs, when a metaphor forms itself, when prose becomes poetry. She would have known that moment well, for she was indeed a poet herself and a maker of poets. In Kathy Wilson's words, Aralee was a, quote, postmodern hybrid who'd figured out how to be alone together, close quote. She also observed that Aralee always looked, quote, like she was writing in her head, close quote. Doubtless she was, writing or thinking of the theater, working out the directions, the staging of a film. She was an unrestrained lyricist rather than a rhymer. In short, a poet, perhaps first and foremost. But because she loved the hue and slew of words, she rejoiced in them equally in her work as a filmmaker and a playwright. Around these parts, she's best known for her versifying and as the founder of Word of Mouth, a monthly open mic forum where Aralee welcomed poets, the novice and the professional, and encouraged them to, quote, pay attention, sign up, and mouth off, close quote. She championed the spoken word, Whitman's yawp, Ginsberg's howl of pain or joy, Kerouac's wandering madness, and Auden's sweet nostalgia. Aralee knew by heart the desolation of that lady weeping at the crossroads. Her obituary is most descriptive of her gentleness as well as her fierceness, quote, she championed the underdog, the underserved, and the underappreciated, while giving short shrift to the self-righteous, the imperious, and the prejudiced, close quote. Through poetry, she cajoled us to look at both the horror of human existence as well as at the good, the happy, and the compassionate. She would have scorned the poetaster, as she does the critic who is too ready to deprecate. Yet in one case, the critic is Aralee herself, as she says, you get a taste for it, you get a figure inching to point, you get a tiny voice inside your head, never stop talking. Could have been better, could have been real, whatever. Should have tried this, that would have been rich. Could have gone longer, should have stopped sooner, should have struck a note we could follow, should have made a map. Should have kept your wits about you, ought to do it this way, ought to think about that. Ought to sit back and let me do it for you. I make the rules. I say whose truth is true, who's fooling who needs to learn what lesson, and who paid what dues. I am the touchstone, the last word on what motivates you, and I don't approve. Just of what didn't Aralee approve? Well, to begin with pain. Pain about which she had a whole series of poems. Pain means hurtfulness. Yep, but it also means indifference, neglect. Weeping a whole heap alone, and lie alone and weep, and rack and sob and heal you. Pain at some point, at every point, part of the human condition for poets, when you can, quote, scratch your name in the window pane grime, and your heart feels broken, and your hands are shaking, and you yearn for perfection, and you cannot run away, close quote. For Aralee, criticism was not natural, and her words left room for Dr. Payne to stroll on Main Street, as she said, go on his or her downtown ramblebone and scat those streets. Find a remedy, take 10, escape for a minute, for an hour, for a while. Aralee's here with us this afternoon, right here in this building dedicated to art. Yep, she's here in spirit, in the memory of those of us who knew this brave, unsparingly honest woman. This woman who could write a poem that defines her life in lines of despair and joy. No poets allowed for the 30th anniversary of the Kent State Massacre. I saw the fine-hewn stones lined with dripping candles dedicated. I trampled on the living, muddy memory of the dead. I read the mean handwriting on the wall and listened long as able to the morbid wail. I heard hot blood roar at the ones who teach dead to the young lives, pale in comparison, who grade them. I kicked the ape in the pit and spat out some poems for the living, who are unafraid, who forgive us for trespassing, who sing, who see the gardens growing in a dark, empty space, who long for resurrection day, when all the good dead come back and rise for once to the top in joyful, noisy, thronging triumph of life over everlasting death. And I came like a one-legged duck full circle to now is the time, now is the place, now is not a horse race. Give me a back seat, a jug of rye whiskey, and singing thou to remember this by give me my daily break. Give me one realized moment a day, and I'll give you a chunk of pyrite blessed by a pure heart and a one-way ticket to paradise. Thank you all, and Ruth, I'll pass it on to you.
Hey, I'm Ruth from Language and Literacy Education, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this nation was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, cultures, and stories, including those of the Muskogee, Creek, Cherokee, and Chickasaw people who took care of the land upon which we teach, work, and live in the state of Georgia. We wish to pay our respects to the Indigenous land caretakers past, present, and emerging. I further wish to acknowledge the enslaved peoples, primarily of African descent, whose labor built much of the wealth of this country, state, and university. We recognize our complicity in the white supremacy structure that continues to inflict damage upon their descendants. For the work that Kevin Burke and I and many others do, we are extremely thankful to Grady Trasher, Kathy Prescott, the museum curators and educators, Athens Community, UGA, not just for funding our speaker series where we can bring in wonderful, inspiring speakers like Tim San Pedro, but also our summer collaboration with the Art Museum. Every summer we run a month-long youth participatory action research program that uses visual art making, mapping, hip-hop artistry, spoken word and performance, among other modalities, to position youth and future language educators in Georgia as leaders in envisioning critical and creative ways to speak back to current justice issues. I thank everyone. Before I hand the floor over to our wonderful doctoral student, Maverick Zong, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping issues so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the seminar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to our presenter. To do so, just type your question into Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. As time allows, Kevin Burke will help moderate questions for Tim at the end of his talk. Also, you'll see a chat box at the bottom of the screen. If you have any technical questions or issues with Zoom, please put any of those questions in the chat. Callan is logged on and can assist you with those. So questions for our presenter in the Q&A box, and about Zoom in the chat feature. Thank you. Over to Mav.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harmon. This is Maverick Zhang from Department of Language and Literacy Education. It's my great pleasure to be here introducing Dr. Timothy San Pedro. I like to start my introduction with a quote from Bessel. We located and are located by our past. Where we were raised, the lessons passed down to us, the friendships created, nurtured, and sustained over time. Dr. San Pedro is an associate professor of multicultural and equity studies in education at the Ohio State University. His scholarship focuses on motivation, engagement, and identity construction, as well as their intricate connections to curricula and pedagogical practices, especially when recentering on Indigenous histories, perspectives, and literacies. His forthcoming book is the inaugural book in the new Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy series, and is titled Protecting the Promise, Indigenous Education Between Mothers and Their Children. The book is also the basis of much of his talk today that focuses on the intergenerational lessons learned in the homes of 5 Native American families, specifically the ways in which they teach one another indigenous knowledges and sovereignty rights as they relate to everyday resurgence efforts. My first encounter with Dr. San Pedro's work was back in the summer of 2019, when I was introduced to his co-authored chapter with Valerie Kinlock, titled Space Between Listening and Storytelling, Foundations for Projects in Humanization. It was that chapter that walked me through the very first course I took on youth participatory action research and culturally sustaining pedagogy. I was then introduced to a number of other articles from Dr. San Pedro, including the article titled Navigating Expansions and Contractions of Identity Between Indigenous and Colonial Paradigms, Pedagogies, and Classrooms. The work Dr. San Pedro does and the stories he tells have supported me and many of my friends and colleagues in making sense of and unmaking sense of our own lived experiences and identifications, and informed our ways of doing and knowing in research, teaching, and beyond. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Timothy San Pedro.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Maverick. It's an honor to be here with you all today. I've been looking at the participant list, and I see friends and former professors that I've had, and just people from all walks of life. So I just want to thank you all for joining and supporting me, including Elena Eagleshield, who is one of the participants on that project that Maverick just mentioned. So thank you for being here, and for all of those names that I have not yet met. I'm so glad that you're here and learning with us in this space. I just want to take a moment to thank the University of Georgia and the Georgia Museum of Art, especially the people who have really helped in making this happen: Kevin Burke, Callan Steinman, and Ruth Harmon. It's been a pleasure in working with you, and so thanks for putting this on. And this series it's a powerful one. There's been such powerful people who have come before me in this series. So I also want to acknowledge the footsteps that have led the way. Jamila Lyascott, Maisha Wynn, and Shirley Bryce Heath were the 3 prior speakers. So I have big shoes to fill, and I'm just really honored to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and get to my slides and kind of walk you through what I'll be sharing today. So I titled today's presentation Methodologies of Mutuality and Care, and I broke it down into 5 so-called chapters that I hope will add to the conversation today. The first is sort of setting the table. The second is Eileen's gift. The third is going back to learn forward. The fourth is collaborative storying. And the fifth one, I had 3 different titles, so hopefully you can help me decide on which one is best for that. So the first chapter, setting the table. Just last week, the incoming editors of Equity and Excellence in Education, Jamila Lyascott, Keisha Green, Justin Coles, and Esther Ojito, hosted a virtual roundtable conversation, and it really was a space for us to share our truths as BIPOC unapologetically, and to do so in a way that brings others to the table. During it, we played with the metaphor of refusing to fight so hard to have a seat at a table that wasn't made for us, but rather we should co-construct and dream of a table that values us, that sees us, and that nourishes us. And in this first chapter, I'd like to invite you to this table that we are creating in this virtual space here. And to do that, I want to offer 2 foundational quotes that really resonate with the topic I'm sharing today. And so before reading these two quotes, I want for us to sit with these quotes just for a moment after I read them to you. And I want you to ask yourself, what does this quote have to do with me and the work that I do? Does this challenge or affirm any of my beliefs? And is this a table that I can sit at and be nourished by the food that's offered, to use that, to extend that metaphor? And I'm gonna have Kevin post these quotes in the chat and ask that if you would like to reply in any way that you feel necessary to address some of those questions. The first one reads, the idea of an outsider to a community doing research was developed out of an expropriative enterprise of research as part of empire building. Moreover, the belief that an outsider is a more objective research operates from the assumption that objective knowledge relies on the, quote, degree to which researchers can detach themselves from the prejudices of the social groups they study. Instead, we understand that more important than an insider-outsider binary is the notion of relationality that is relative to the community, the existing context, and particular work. So I just want to read that last part again. We understand that more important than an insider-outsider binary is the notion of relationality that is relative to the community, the existing context, and the particular work. And the second quote is, Indigenous methodologies ask both Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers to situate themselves within their research as active participants, as community members, and as people connected to the individuals with whom they research. As Linda Smith poignantly articulates, quote, in Indigenous research frameworks, relationships matter. Respectful, reciprocal, genuine relationships lie at the heart of community life and community development. A critical engagement of Indigenous methodologies urges researchers to deeply reflect on their own positionality and investments, as well as untangle and investigate the relationship they have to the research they do. And so I just want for us just to take a moment or two to think through the contributions of these two foundational quotes as we sort of set the table for the presentation today. And Kevin has posted both of those quotes. If you need a refresher on the first one, I'm going to keep the second one up here. And just think about this. How does this relate to the work that I do? Does this challenge or affirm any of my beliefs? And is this a table that I can sit at and be nourished by the food that's offered? So I'll just take a couple of minutes. And if you would like to share through the chat function, I'd be happy to read those a little bit later. And so I'm going to continue on, but please, 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 you know, if you're typing something, post it, even if it's in process, even if it has an ellipses at the end as a thought that's ongoing. I would love to hear from you as we think through these foundational quotes here. So Maverick, it was interesting that he chose that quote. It was something that I had chosen to include in my presentation as well. And it's a quote from Basso, and it's worth repeating. We locate and are located by our past, where we were raised, the lessons passed down to us, the friendships created, nurtured, and sustained over time. And so I'm going to share a little bit about my past. I engage in this work from a place of solidarity and support, all of which have been taught to me in loving ways by the community that collectively raised me on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Northwest Montana, homelands to the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille tribes. Because of the kinship and bonds created at such a young age and the welcoming of me into Indigenous community and family structures, it took me some time and loving conversations to understand that the histories and cultural backgrounds of my Indigenous friends were different from my own. As a Filipino American who at the age of 4 was removed from my Filipino ethnic identity because of a divorce, I began to learn the customs and traditions of my Indigenous friends and their families when we moved there. I learned over time that my positionality was at times included and other times excluded based on the people and places that I was with, and that I had to recognize and honor the ways that others place me in relation to them. It was always through invitation that I took part in tribal events, and when that invitation did not come, I knew there were very good reasons that I could not be a part of them. And so upon entering high school, I became more and more critical of an education that was void of the Indigenous stories, histories, and knowledges that centered on land, sovereignty, and tradition that I've been gifted access through those relationships. Some of my Indigenous friends also noticed this absence, and they did something about it. They either left school altogether or transferred to a nearby high school that had higher population of Indigenous students, or they endured the trauma while still excelling academically in the face of narrowed curricula. And at that time, I began to question what was happening in our education that was forcing them and me to become increasingly disengaged from school. I kept searching for this answer while, as a PhD student, I was learning what it meant to be a, quote, educational researcher. And during my journey as a student, I remember the norms and values taught to me on the Flathead Indian Reservation. They were in direct conflict with what I was being asked to believe as an emergent researcher. I remember one particular class in which my methodology instructor said, "You need distance from your subjects in order to analyze data correctly. And once the data collection stage has concluded, so does your communication with subjects." I remember being at the back of the class under my breath saying, "That's ridiculous." Apparently I said it loud enough, louder than I had intended, and the instructor asked if I'd like to expand upon my thoughts. And so I wasn't expecting this, and through shaky voice, I said that this hard and fast lesson that he was asking us to accept as truth, that relationships are seen as weaknesses in the research process, that any sort of relationship that was formed completely ends once the data is collected. It was so far from the lessons that I had been taught in my community. Knowing I had a responsibility to my classmates and to myself and to my communities to challenge these dangerous research paradigms, I shared what was taught to me from the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille peoples that I grew up with. I was taught that relationships are sacred. And just because an IRB or an international review board tells me that my research is concluded, doesn't mean that the relationships forged in such research settings also completely stops. And then I got really fired up. And I said, if all we are doing is pretending to be interested in order to pull and extract information from others, then your definition of research is deeply problematic, sir. Well, I didn't say sir, I just added that now for effect. But the point is I was really fired up. And this was not the only time though. As I was learning how to do this thing called research as a grad student, I found myself slowly falling into the trap of collecting pain narratives, or what Eve Tuck calls damage-based research. She reminds us that to frame our communities as only damaged, as only broken, limits the desires, the imagination, the ingenuity, the love, and hope that are also part of these stories. Our communities are so much more than that damage, than that pain. And extending this, Casey Wong and Courtney Pena shared that as researchers, we are well versed and prepared, and I would even add trained to write damage narratives. They state that we are often less literate in reading desire than pain. When we fail to support a literacy of pleasure and joy, we risk overlooking and undervaluing cultures and traditions of beatitude that are just as in need of being sustained, extended, and complicated in the interest of moving toward wholeness. And so with the guidance of so many people and scholars like Maisha Wynn, Django Paris, Valerie Kinlock, Jason Irizarry, Brian Brayboy, Mary Eunice Romero-Little, Mariano Soto-Manning, and so many others who have centered methodologies of mutuality and care in their work and lives, I began to move out from the shadow that Western research norms was casting and into the light where relationships mattered, where who we are as people matter, where the lessons taught to us by family and community, those matter. And so these lessons have helped me to walk lightly in this world, to always listen heart forward first, and to be humble when invited into opportunities of knowledge sharing. And so chapter 2, Eileen's gift. For 3 years, I learned with a veteran teacher, Miss B, who with the help of Arizona State professors Simon Ortiz, James Blassingame, and Kyle Wilson and others, began a new course titled Native American Literature. This was a 12th grade English elective course and the only such course in this valley, despite the large population of Native American students in the area. Pictured here are the students from that class. This was taken 2 years after I had seen them when we came back together to reminisce about how impactful this course was for them. Among the many stories shared with me was Eileen's, and she's pictured here in the center holding her daughter. She explains that this particular course was her first and only class that really centered her stories, communities, and tribe. She identifies as half Navajo, half African American. And often the Indigenous-centered content from the course made its way into her home, she said. And she found herself teaching her parents at home the lessons she was learning in school. In addition, her father, after hearing that Eileen was taking this course, began sharing with her lessons about her tribe, and she then shared in class. Knowledge in this instance was dialogic between the home and school, something she had never experienced in all her K-11 years. Her dad also decided that he would only speak Navajo when she was home so that she could begin practicing her language. Taking this course allowed her to have deeper, more meaningful conversations with her family in her home and in her community, a wonderful benefit that she did not anticipate. And at the time, I wrote a memo to myself. I said, I wish I could listen to those stories, to those lessons that Eileen is sharing with her family and that they are now teaching her. Those are the lessons that we need in schools and in our communities. They need to be seen and heard. And Eileen's story was one of many that were shared with me during my prior 3-year research project. And during that time, I was focused so much on the ways a significant shift in schooling curriculum, one that moved away from traditional Eurocentric content toward the recentering of Indigenous knowledges, impacted students' motivation and engagement. And unfortunately, because of the in-school focus, I was not able to hear how those lessons of indigeneity were moving back and forth between home and school. And so I went back to learn forward. Years later, I came back to the powerful moment that Eileen shared with me and the memo I wrote to myself that essentially asked the question, what powerful lessons of culture, of language, of navigating schooling systems are being shared in the homes? And so I did a preliminary search, as we do in research, with keywords Native American and parental involvement in schools. And you can do this too, it'll show the same results. And what came back had titles like Health Disparities in Youth and Families and The Destruction of American Indian Families. And I was reading research articles steeped in deficit paradigms, hyper-visualizing all the things that are wrong with Indigenous communities, the health disparities, the crippling intergenerational trauma, the hopelessness of the Native American experience as they shared. And these narratives, they were so far from those that I was witnessing from powerful Indigenous women in my life, women I've had long-standing friendships with since high school and college and beyond. Michael Munson, Christina Lucero, Elena Eagleshield, who's with us today, Tara Ramos, Faith Price, all pictured here with friends and family. Elena is right there. Having remained in their lives, mostly through social media, commenting on their posts, life updates, events, hearting and liking their posts, direct messaging them when things were tough, I saw their families growing, their children getting older, the pride and hope they had for one another. Through social media, I was fortunate to be front row to see and witness many everyday interactions they had with their children and with their communities. I saw stories of language and tribal revitalization, of critical consciousness development, of standing up to bureaucracy, of navigating school systems, and on and on. The powerful stories and lives of these mothers and their children did not match the research steeped in deficits about Indigenous communities. And so, being so far from them in Ohio, I traveled to my friends in Washington, in Montana, in North Dakota. I ate meals in their homes, barbecued on back porches, roasted marshmallows over rock-circled fires, cooked adobo chicken and pancit for them, and took part in a Calling Our Spirits Home ceremony. It was at these dinner tables and back porches where we updated each other on our lives, where their kiddos and I got the chance to begin to know each other. It was also there that I shared with them Eileen's story and how she helped me to realize that there were so many powerful stories happening in the homes. And so I asked them, if I were to devote my time and energy into developing opportunities for them to share their stories of intergenerational learning in the home, would they want to be part of it? And if so, what might that look like? What stories would they want to center when it comes time to sharing their stories with the world? In answering these questions, we co-developed this project. We coordinated the methods used, we co-envisioned the hope of what it could be and become, and we shared stories that honored our relationships. We co-created this work together in the space between us and not in the absence of us. So Margaret Kovach defines collaborative storying as an Indigenous research method that positions the researcher as a participant in the project. As both parties become engaged in a collaborative process, the relationship builds and deepens as stories are shared. Valerie Kinloch and I, in connecting with Indigenous and Black thought, extend this definition by offering projects in humanization, which ask researchers and participants to situate their identities, educational, political, and cultural, familial, in order to connect their stories to issues of injustice, inequity, and oppression. And so for the better part of a year, I connected with the families whose stories fill this book. Altogether, we met 35 times through their preferred video and audio software, FaceTime, Google Hangout, Skype. There were audio and video recorded. Our final recorded conversation occurred in person when we all came together in my hometown of Polson, Montana. We came together to teach and learn with one another the many lessons we discussed through our online conversations. And we referred to this moment as the Montana Gathering, a place to share our stories, be impacted by one another, see connections across family stories and experiences, and challenge and push certain lessons based on different contexts. And so although all of the participants knew of the study's purpose, since they co-developed it with me, to listen and learn the ways lessons centering on culture, community, language are taught in the home, I intentionally never began our conversation with questions that I had predetermined. Our conversations were not scripted, they were not structured or even semi-structured. We always began as friends and families do, by checking in, asking about updates in our lives, taking a moment to be present with one another. The conversations began where they wanted it to. But this didn't mean that I was unprepared for those conversations. I made it a habit to always listen again to the previous conversation, taking note on the ways I was impacted. I thought of this as listening to connect and envisioned myself as a story supporter rather than a story gatherer. My purpose was not to extract the stories I wanted to hear, but to provide space for mothers and their children to share the stories that were central to them at the time of the telling. And as they took the lead as storytellers, I listened for moments that connected to previous stories they shared with me. This helped me stay in the moment and extend the conversations by encouraging them to make links to prior stories shared. Not having predetermined question allowed space for the stories to unfold more naturally based on their intended purposes. So they led the story sharing, and I asked follow-up questions or clarifying ones to give to the conversation, to show that I was listening closely and carefully to what they had to say, while restoring these family stories in an effort to connect. I realized and was intentional that in the drafting of the chapters, I worked hard to maintain the wholeness of their stories. This led to my abandoning of qualitative software like In Vivo, because it felt as though the stories were ripped and stripped of their context, set off in some unfamiliar location, only to be grouped back together in a new way, a new story that I, as a researcher and analyst, felt was important. And Bell Hooks writes about this research phenomenon of taking stories, reshaping and altering them into something unrecognizable by those who initially shared their story. She says, I want to know your story, take your story, only to retell it back to you in a new way, tell it back to you in such a way that it has become mine, my own. And my work as a story stitcher and story supporter was in response to Hook and others like Lee Patel and Eve Tuck, cautioning us to be careful with the stories given and gifted to us, to be dialogic, answerable, reciprocal, and co-constructive with those who shared stories so as to agree on the form and function those stories take on. I resisted this temptation by centering the power of their stories as told as close to verbatim by the mothers and the children themselves, and kept whole and intact. And to do so means that participation in story shaping doesn't end once the stories are recorded and transcribed, analyzed and shared in the absence of those gifted their stories to us. Throughout the entire process and beyond, there needs to be, as in all healthy relationships, agreement, consent, and dialogic participation in the drafting of stories. Subsalian refers to such processes as bearing witness, whereas Wynne and Ubiles offer being a worthy witness, which collectively mean to listen with our hearts and minds in an effort to hear the necessary disruptions already occurring in the lives of the people and places we work with, in order to imagine and envision a more hopeful future. Their words, the words of the mothers and their children, were spoken by them, then transcribed and shaped initially by me into narratives that were as easy to absorb as possible in an effort to center who we were to and for, our communities, our tribal nations, our youth and families. And once a draft of each of the family story chapter was shaped, I created a secure link to their respective chapter stories so that we could both read from and modify the existing document. And the first draft of each chapter was simply that, a draft that could be changed, altered, adjusted, or removed by the mothers and children themselves. It was there in the shared and negotiated space that we, the mothers, children, and me, reworked their stories, added to them, deleted stories that were only intended for us, and corrected or updated information into the version that you will see here. So this is the book that's coming out on April 2nd, and I think Kevin shared a link with you on that. So this is the one that I had a tough time with the chapter heading. It's either research is story, or story is theory, or knowledge beyond hegemony. And so for this chapter, I'll let these amazing Indigenous mothers and their children speak for themselves. These are stories we agreed should be shared with an imagined audience beyond us, because they offer lessons that we felt were important for others to learn from and could maybe connect with. And I'll just provide a bit of context that will help you all know where these stories are originating, and just providing a little bit of context to understand them. Elena, I'm sharing the video clip of Eileen and her language discovery, the YouTube videos that you shared. Just a heads up. All right, so this first one is Mali in community. And this is a story from Michael Munson and Mali, who at the time was 1 turning 2. And Michael is sharing how she's a community baby, that when they're in the longhouse, when they're gathered by community, that it's a space of family, and that she sometimes kind of loses track of her, which is frowned upon in the white world. But in this context, it's filled with love and support.
Like, why did you bring Molly? Was it just
because it's important for her to be around people who are speaking the language in her family. And I mean, it's like I said, it's the place where you can go and be with like your hugely large extended family. It's like people who all share the same values, right?
Yeah.
Or at least the same belief in the power and knowledge and importance of language revitalization. I mean, and why wouldn't we want to surround her with that?
Right.
With all of those beautiful kiddos and elders and people.
Absolutely. So how did she
Sorry, let me cut it off a little short.
like what?
Maybe.
Yeah. So everybody's looking after her at this. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, I feel a little bit like it's this weird like space to be in, because in the white world that's very irresponsible, right? As for a mother to be like, I have no idea where my daughter is,
Right?
But I know she's okay. Like, but in our community, that's also, it's not. It's okay to have her be with her auntie, and because she loves her and she takes care of her, and they're off to something, and
Yeah.
All right. So I'm not going to do much of analyzing. I just want for you to feel the stories and feel as though that you're a part of those conversations with us, and feeling the power of what they have to share. And so this next video is Eileen and Elena sharing the Lakota language and these videos that they created with one another to share with their community about how to engage in this language learning as they move through it.
The phrases that we've been learning, I've been teaching my daughter, we're working on conjugation with her.
Verb Phrases in Lakota, a short film by Elena Eagleshield and Kylan Eagleshield.
Akoni chapiha.
Kylan matcha.
Ni Lakota ha.
Malakota.
Ni stima ha.
Mommy steamer.
Kikta ya chungshi. Yakta ha.
Ha, what the?
Hiakbajaja ha.
Ha, hiwakbajaja.
Nape ni glujaja ha.
Ha, nape me glujaja.
Ogale ki yatju ha.
Ha, ogale what you.
Ogale ki yaglushloka ha.
Ogale what you look at.
All right, in this this next one, fighting special ed. Oh, okay. This one is with Christina and her boy Demetrius, and she talks about how Demetrius is having troubles navigating schooling spaces, and this constant pressure that him and Christina are having to face in being forced into special ed classes and being forced English as a second language labels, and her reasoning, what she thinks is the reasoning for that.
We have parent-teacher conferences next week, and he's literally like not trying at all, and it's so hard. And he's smart, and they wanted to put him in like a special ed class, which I was like,
what?
He's not a special ed. There's a difference between a kid who's not trying,
right?
But and that's another thing that really pisses me off about the school system. Their whole school career here, they've tried to put my kids into like special needs classes because they get more money. Not only because they're Native, but they would also be able to access like the Native special needs funding, which I think is just bullshit, because none of that ever goes to them, which is why one of the things that I'm going to do is go talk to this high school, because if I can't get them into Upward Bound, like I want to know what they're doing to help my child prepare for college, because it's just not, I know they get special money just because they have them listed at the school as having English as a second language, which is, and I was like, what, why did you, I've never checked that box. Like, I don't know what you're, why are you saying that? And they had that, they approached me with that information in middle school. So throughout all of elementary school and halfway through middle school, so like 7 years of their education, they had them listed as that. And I was just like, where did all that funding go? Like, I know you got extra funding for that, but I don't think that that ever went to my kid. Like,
and so that story that Christina shared, I think it's important, and we agreed that it was important to include in the book because there are these systems and processes that try to take advantage of youth in this type of way. And even though there is pain in that narrative, it's pain that needs to be shared in order for it to be corrected. And so we felt confident in moving forward with that story. And so this next story is one between Faith and Dahlia. Or no, not Faith and Dahlia. This one is Tara and Sila. And Sila and Tara went to the city council to speak in support of changing Columbus Day to Indigenous People Day. And both of them talk about that car ride as they went to City Hall in preparing for what they had to say there.
Remember what I said, but I do remember Sila, the moment that Sila spoke, and you know, the amount of pride I felt and the amount of love I felt for her, like that she stepped up and did it, you know, like I had to convince her to do it. You know, we spent about an hour, I spent an hour coaching her and talking her through why it would be valuable for a young person her age to get up and speak, because it's really hard for young people to get up and speak in those spaces. And, you know, first of all, just being told that you can do it and no matter what you say, I'll be there, you know, trying to give her that unconditional love and support in that moment. But also really like demanding that she step into that space. Like the way I figured, I wish somebody had pushed me. I mean, I didn't really need all that much pushing, but I wish somebody was there to coach me and talk me through it and, you know, help me. You know, I really didn't help with her message. That was all her. But I did tell her, you know, because at first she didn't want to do it. And I was like, no, this is my expectation for you. You know, if we say we're Indigenous and that we care about our community and that we care about how we're perceived, then we have to be willing to put ourselves out there. And we have to be willing to step outside what we're comfortable with.
Right.
And I think that's when the moment that she decided that it didn't matter how uncomfortable it was going to be, she was going to do it. Like she made the decision. I did tell her, you know, after I like had this, she was like having a breakdown in the car. And I said, okay, you clearly don't want to do this and I'm not going to make you do it then. And she changed her mind. She's like, no.
That was really scary for me, actually.
Yeah.
We had, she was like, hey, you're speaking. She was like, hey, do you want to come? And then she's like, by the way, you're speaking tonight. She likes to do that to me.
Yeah.
She's like, tell me. And like, oh yeah, you're speaking. Oh, great. Cool. I'll do that.
Well, talk about that. Like her pushing you to speak.
At times I'm like, why? I wasn't prepared for this. But it's really nice because I guess it's proof to me that I can speak in front of people and like I don't need to like meticulously go over every single word that I'm saying because it will just flow, especially when I believe in something a lot. And I've also learned that I cry even when I am prepared. That's just something that I do. And that was the first time I was like in front of a big group of people and I was terrified. I was like, oh no, I'm going to say something wrong. I'm going to talk too long. This is just going to be a complete disaster. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't. Turned out pretty well. I made people in the audience cry, which was very surprising, I guess. And I didn't realize like how much I could affect people until that moment.
And for this next one, this is Faith and Dahlia, and they're talking about being seen and unseen in schooling spaces. And a fight at Dahlia's institution, her undergrad institution, for curricular change in a foundational course that does not include any BIPOC. And they start with talking about how important it is to have a Native American instructor to be seen, to understand those experiences. And just a viewing tip, try to focus on the non-speaker because they're side by side.
Hey, Dahlia, do you remember taking that American Indian Studies class and like reaching out to your mom about all these different things? Do you remember those conversations?
Yeah, I remember because I would get done like around 6:30 at night, and then I'd just call her like on my way home or something.
Yeah.
Or like when I got home, and I'd just like rant to her and be like, "Oh my gosh, this happened. Did you know this?" And then I said this.
I just remember her telling me, like, I realized at some point, this was the first time she'd had an American Indian teacher in her entire life.
Yeah.
Like, never throughout elementary, middle school, high school, none of that. But I remember her saying to me that she felt like she could contribute to this class and her voice really mattered because she knew about these things and they were relative to her life. And I just thought, that is so important. It's so key. And I mean, to go through your whole educational career without having that feeling, it's wrong. Yeah. But go ahead, I can see.
Wait, Mom, did I tell you that I was chosen for like representative of my whole department?
No, for what?
For they're bringing 3 college, like from Columbia, Dartmouth, and Bard University. They're bringing outside evaluators for Hume 110. And so each department got to choose a representative. So I went, and this was on Wednesday, and no one was critiquing the content at all. And I was just like, I ranted, and it was nice in like a civilized way. I ranted.
Oh, I'm so proud of you. Yay. I'm glad someone said something. Nobody said anything?
No, okay. So all they did was talk about how, are the lectures effective? Do you like the style of the lectures? Blah, blah, blah. Do you like how you have little conferences? Blah, blah, blah. So they're only talking about like the pedagogy instead of like the actual content of the class. And so, like, it was getting, like, towards the last 15 minutes of this hour-long kind of thing. And so I finally participated. I was like, I just wanted to, like, talk about how the content of this course privileges, like, Western knowledge systems and how it affects people who aren't from this background. And if Reed really wants to focus on diversity and inclusivity, they wouldn't make this the single required course. And because it like makes people with different backgrounds uncomfortable in participating. And they're mainly arguing that a conference style course was like necessary to kind of get into like the Reed mindset. And I'm like, it doesn't make me want to participate if first of all we're critiquing the problems in the material. And I was like, I'm not saying that there's not value in like Aristotle, but we can't just let people go through 4 years of Reed without critiquing a single thing. And so I was saying stuff like that. And then I was like, and like, since I'm like a brown woman and there's all these things that are racist and sexist, and it's not my job to bring up these critiques and stuff like that. And I was like, why can't we have like different courses offered for different groups and blah, blah, blah. And so then I was done, and then everyone was uncomfortable, and I was just sitting there kind of angry. And then and then they kind of like moved on, and then this one like white girl who's sitting next to me like 5 minutes after I got done was like, well, I just really agree with you and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, sweet. But then afterwards, after she agreed with me, then everyone was like, oh yeah, it was a good point. So it took like a white girl to agree with me for people to care. But
I'm so proud of you. That's awesome.
I was really fired up. I was going to talk to you about it, but I was
yeah.
And so after that, after compiling all those stories, we, instead of creating a conclusion, we ended up writing questions that we wanted an imagined audience to think through and to consider. And we thought about a community context, we thought about schooling context, and how these stories would help in making those questions more clear or more cloudy. And so that's how we ended this book. And this is what it looks like, and it'll be on shelves April 2nd and available for pre-order now in that link that Kevin shared. And we're in process of doing a book launch through the University of Washington. That's where Jingo Paris is at on April 22nd at 7 p.m. So so that's that. Hey, Kevin.
Hey, thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate it. So there are comments in the chat, as you've seen, and as people are sending their questions through the Q&A. I think I'm going to start because I see some of my students are in and we just read one of your pieces. So you reference space quite a bit in this talk, and you've written about it in the past, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the concept of sacred space as you think of it in relation to these data here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we talk about safe space, we're continuing to center the safety of particular people that have been protected by institutions and by society. And so I think we need to reconsider what we think about safety in these spaces when we're having these conversations. We need to share our truths and share our truths in a sacred place. So I use the term sacred truth space, which is a combination of sacred spaces from Lee Patel, or true spaces from Lee Patel, and sacred space from Jeremy Garcia and Valerie Shirley. And what I'm attempting to do by combining those two different terms is to say, when we come together, when we have conversations, agreement isn't always going to happen, but we need to have a space where we can share our identities in motion and in process. And instead of engaging in, what is often taught as debate in schooling contexts, where we listen only to win the argument, we listen to counter a point, we need to engage in dialogue where we're listening to understand the other person's perspective and position, and engage in a conversation that way. And I feel like so often we stumble into this debate stage because that's what's taught to us in schooling spaces, that arguments need to be won rather than engaging in dialogue where we can share and understand our positions in relation to other people. So that's what I was thinking when I was thinking about sacred truth space. And in this project that I shared here, it developed from a different space, right? Usually research projects begin not knowing the people that we enter into relationships with. But this one, there are long established relationships from these friends from high school and beyond. And so we had a different level of trust, of vulnerability, but it was important. There was sort of a give and take with engaging in a research that had established relationships. Because if I produce something, or if we wrote something, or if I shared something, maybe, for example, in this presentation, that wasn't something that we had agreed upon, that should be shared with the outside world, then what's on the line is my relationship with these people. And first and foremost, I want to strengthen our relationship and not do anything to jeopardize that relationship. And so I think it's starting from a different area. But I think when we think about working with participants who are new to us, we need to have an opportunity to connect. We need to not only share what it is that we're working on, but to listen to the questions that they have in relation to the work that we're doing, and have sort of a grace period, a get to know you period, so that trust can be established and people can choose to enter into those relationships. Yeah, so that's what I was thinking with that.
I love it. I'm so grateful for that. Hey, so there's a question from Mary, and I'm going to ask her to unmute here.
Great.
And she can ask it of you. Mary, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay.
Perfect. Oh, this is so exciting. Okay, so I'll just ask it as I wrote it. In our class recently, we just read Humanizing Research, and it's a PAR class. We've been talking about co-authorship. Do you have a position on co-authorship? And perhaps I just missed it. You may have said it in the beginning. You talk about co-creating, cooperating, collaborating, and even throughout the writing process, like on Google Docs.
Mm-hmm.
How do you push publishers or journals and even in tenure review boards to accept co-authorship with community members?
Oh, what an easy question. Yeah. You know, it was interesting because I had a learning experience with this project. I had signed a contract for this book, Protecting the Promise, not knowing that I couldn't go back and have it be a co-authored project on the front cover. What I wanted and had envisioned is to have all of the names on the front cover. And so what I ended up doing, because I couldn't go back on that, was the chapters themselves were co-author projects between the mothers, children, and me. And it really was that. It was a collaborative nature where we wrote collectively, where they shared their stories. I put them into narrative form, and then we went through that negotiation process of which stories were shared to the result that you'll see here on April 2nd. But as far as the academia not necessarily giving as much weight to collaborative projects, it needs to change. And I think I was talking with some grad students earlier today at University of Georgia, and somebody said that that for maybe it was their institution or another institution, that for tenure they actually give more weight to collaborative projects when people work with students to co-author things. And I think that that's so important. I mean, for me anyway, nothing that I write is individual. Nothing that we think or shape or share is isolated. It's always with other people. And so I think the more we can engage in that collaborative nature of thinking and writing and understanding and giving credit to that, the better I think the better the stories can emerge. And actually from this project, and I think you shared it, Kevin, is a publication that Elena Eagleshield and Michael Munson, after this project, we were invited to write an article for the Equity and Excellence in Education journal as they changed leadership and refocused their direction for that journal. And they were the lead authors on that. It was Elena Eagleshield, Michael Munson, and me, even though I was the one who was invited into it because of my academic relationships and, maybe some of the work that's come before. But, the more that we can, and I did that intentionally, right? That Elena Eagleshield, she is a student at the University of Washington. She's an academic or a community leader. She's co-creating a school and clinic on Standing Rock. She's doing all these amazing things, and she needs that recognition. She needs that credit. And Michael Munson as well. She's doing amazing work at her community, the Flathead Indian Reservation where we grew up, in developing a teacher education program that focuses both on culture and on teacher preparation. And so for those two, the publication was good because it was an opportunity to build a CV, but also to share the powerful stories and the work that they're doing. And so that's one of the ways that the collaboration can come together in that way.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Great to hear your voice, Mary.
Yeah.
Tim, there's a question in the chat there from Tyran, and so maybe you can address that. Or actually, you know what? I'm going to ask that because I know Tyran, so I'm going to make her talk. Hey, Tyran, do you mind asking your question?
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. Thank you for that presentation, Dr. San Pedro, and all the voices that you've shared with us. from your community and friends. So I'm just wondering, what were some things that you had to do or write down on the IRB request to gain that IRB approval, to go through the gatekeepers that are still in place?
Yeah, what I've learned over the years is, each institution has a different IRB process, right? I've also learned that the IRB is to protect institutions and not necessarily participants or people. And so you're right, there are definitely gatekeepers. And so the way that I went about the IRB process, as I mentioned within this work here, is before even generating it, I spoke with the participants in the project and co-envisioned it with them. What would it look like? How often would we meet? What sort of methods would we use to gather content and information? And in that process, initially it was like a lot of journaling. Of course, we had recorded conversations. I sent each of them recorders that they could, share clips of conversations in the home. But that was pretty invasive for them, it turned out. And so we adjusted to have conversations that were conversational based through the audio and video tools that we have at our disposal. And so that's what it's become. But your question about IRB, it's tricky. I think the important thing is to that it's exempt or not exempt. Is it exempt? I'm questioning myself. The one where you can modify and continue the project outside of the confines. It's still an ongoing project for me, so that as things change, as things develop, you can create amendments to include, for example, having people as co-authors. You can say, what, this has become something where participants are really working with me at the capacity of co-researching with me. So you have an opportunity to amend that, to change that. Whereas I can't remember the other one, but the one below that is you can't really change it. You have to do what it is that you say you do without any changes. So I think making sure that you write it in a way where you can modify, adapt, and change as the project changes, that will serve you in the long run. Expedited, thank you. Yes.
You're not up on your bureaucratic.
Yeah, I know.
So I see Felipe has his hand up, and so Felipe, I'm gonna unmute you, assuming you have a question. And if you don't, then we will just know because you won't have a question.
Hello, Dr. Tim San Pedro.
Hey, Felipe.
My name is Felipe Can. I am from Guatemala, Mayan, and I am doing my research, my work, my loving work for my Mayan students in the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. And there are some forces, invisible forces, that are our work, and it's kind of hard to visualize them. One of those forces I'm trying to understand is the force of epistemicide, which is the genocide of intellectuality. So could you please expand a little more that concept, and how can we, or can I learn about strategies how to recognize this genocide of intellectuality? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. And you're absolutely right. I hadn't heard of that term, but it makes complete sense. I just want to share with you a few key authors that I'll type within the chat here. Sean Wilson, Joanne Archibald, Margaret Kovac, and many others who are focused on Indigenous research methodologies in really, the purpose of Indigenous research methodologies is to really acknowledge the history, the wealth of knowledge that exists within community, that exists within tribal nations already, and to honor that, recognize that, and use that in research contexts. And I think for so often, we've operated within research paradigms that are Western by design, that have lessons that I shared with you, that my instructor, was trying to indoctrinate me into, that relationships don't matter, that, there's a hard cutoff when the data collection ends. And so I think that we're still, me included, I'm still sort of deprogramming from that training and that understanding. And so what I would suggest to you, I know Keisha Green, I don't know if she's still on this, but Keisha Green in the Humanizing Research book, a book edited by Django Paris and Maisha Wynn, she talks about double Dutch methodology. And that methodology is something that she saw in her Black neighborhood, of something that she experienced as a youth, and matched that with the type of research that she was doing. And so what she ended up doing was creating a method that centered her experience, that centered her participant experience in a way that made sense to her. Rather than relying on somebody else's methodology, she created something new. And I was just talking to grad students earlier today, and one of them, was talking a little bit about what you were, and she was asking, how do we do this work? There's nothing out there that shows us, that this is valid work. And she was talking about how she has conversations, or she had conversations while cooking with people as part of her project. And I was like, that is a method in itself, right? The ways that we talk while creating meals together, the conversations that we have at kitchen tables, there's so much richness in that, that can be connected to the communities where we're at. And so I think we need to, and I know that there's limitations to that. That's where the genesis of your question came from. I know that there's limitations to it because it might not be out there necessarily, but I think we need to have the courage in order to create these methods and methodologies that center ourselves, that center the communities and places that we care about, and that relies on their expertise in order to drive the project itself.
Thanks, Tim. We are right about up against time, so I want to ask one final question, and then we'll hand it to Callan to do some thank yous, and then we'll say goodbye. I'm wondering if you can just talk about the role of hope and joy in the work that you do, because I think that's hugely valuable and probably the best way to end.
Yeah. It was out of a bit of frustration that I engaged in this project, knowing that there's so much research out there that frames the communities that I love and care about in such painful ways. And like I said, we're trained as researchers to really focus in on that, to figure out what's wrong with other communities that don't necessarily match with the white hegemony, the standard bar that's been set in school, in community, and other places. And I feel like there's so much that we can learn from multiple communities, not just Indigenous communities, about different ways of being that honor self, that honor land, that center water and relationships to all of those things. And so so for me, the hope and the care is really about dreaming forward. And that's what the article that Elena Eagleshield and Michael Munson centered our conversation on, was thinking years ahead, generations ahead. What can we do now in order to create the communities and the people that are happy, that are healthy, that are organizing for justice and for indigeneity? What can we do now in order to achieve those? And so for me, these stories are about hope. These stories are, comes from a space of mutuality and care. And I feel like, as we go out and as we think about different projects that we do, I think we need to resist the temptation to really cast our lens on particular communities. Instead, be in relationship with communities and understand the problems, the questions, the solutions that they already have to offer prior to our being there. And so these women and their children who have shaped this process, they embody all of that. And it's through our relationships to one another where we can share and shape that story with an audience beyond us.
Thank you so much. So I'll get out of the way. I'll hand it to Callan so she can give us some housekeeping and some thank yous, and but just generally speaking, Tim, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Tim. I did want to mention to everybody who's logged on, I've seen a couple questions about whether the program is going to be recorded. It is being recorded now, and we'll be putting that link on our Vimeo and YouTube channels at the museum in the next week, and I'll be emailing that link out to everybody who registered. So it can be shared even with those who weren't able to join us live today. So yeah, just to wrap us up, thanks again to Kevin and Ruth, Maverick, and all the other graduate students in language and literacy education for being such wonderful partners year after year. It's been so fun to work with you guys on these different programs here at the Georgia Museum of Art. Thanks again to Kathy Prescott and Grady Thrasher for their generous support of the Aralee Strange Fund that makes this lecture series and all of our other art and poetry programming possible. And finally, thanks so much to Tim for your time today, for being with us. This was a wonderful presentation, and I feel energized and excited. So that's a good way to leave any talk like this. So thank you again to Tim, and thanks to all of you in the audience for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you all for being here.
Bye.
See ya.